Myself, I am, as Ryan said, a senior managing director at FTI Consulting. It's a global firm. We are a business consulting firm, help people tell their story more effectively. Simple as that. And I am a recovering journalist. I was born and raised in New York. I was the editor-in-chief of the New York Post. I started my career at the Post and became editor-in-chief there. And then moved over as editor-in-chief of the Daily News. So I ran both those tabloids in New York. So I'm kind of, I know where these guys are coming from in many ways from that side. And I will introduce the panel in 1 second. You know, this is about covering cannabis, which is a completely quote-unquote new business. And, you know, once covering the drug business, if you will, it was all about nicknames like El Chapo and El Mata Amigos and Freeway and Mr. Untouchable. Today, it's a completely different beat, obviously. It is now a mainstream issue. It's legal in many places on a lot of different variety of ways. So there are people in here now. There's economic coverage, there's social coverage, there are business angles here and that have never been visualized before in this country and recently. Our panelists will discuss the challenges and opportunities and the inherent contradictions of covering an industry that is legal on one side of the state line and illegal on the other, and halfway illegal on one side of the state line and no part way to legal on the other side of the state line. So it's really a complex business, and I think it's very interesting. And so it's new in many ways. There are endless angles here, as we said. So what we'll do is we'll Q&A session here, a lot from the panel, and then we'll just open it up. And I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. We have Deborah Beauchart, who is Forbes, a contributor to Forbes, needs no introduction at Outlet, is for a long time. Next to Deborah is Peter Kerr, a former Times reporter who's a colleague of mine now at FTI Consulting. He's gone over to the dark side, as we like to say. And next to Peter, going across the room, is Nushin Rashidian, who runs a website called Cannabis Wire, which is dedicated to serious discussion around, I think, the cannabis business. I'll let you describe that even better. Founded by two women, by the way, Nushin and her partner, who is also in the audience. And thirdly, last but not least, we have Herman Lopez from Vox, which is a general news site. I believe it attracts a lot of eyeballs. All of them have covered cannabis, and we'll just let you guys introduce yourselves a little bit more, and then we'll just jump right in here. Deborah?
Hi, I'm Deborah Borchardt. I've been writing on the cannabis beat for several years now. I wrote on it at thestreet.com, and then now I'm a contributor at Forbes, so I've been covering it mostly from a financial point of view.
I'm Peter Kerr. I've been, in one way or another, relating to media and marijuana since the 1980s. I covered illegal drugs, including marijuana, during the rise of crack and well into the 90s. I then went over, as Lou says, to the dark side, but one of the organizations I worked for was Phoenix House, the large drug treatment organization. And now among my clients, Kerr, which operates dispensaries and develops marijuana in 5 states and Washington, D.C.
Did you want us to get into sort of why we got into this beat, or you want a more brief introduction?
Well, just we'll go. I'll ask that one. Maybe we'll start there as soon as you're done. Just introduce yourselves, and then we'll ask about how.
Sure. I'm a journalist. I went to Columbia Journalism School where I met Allison Martin, and from there, this was 2009. That was just the moment where you saw sort of California trying to legalize, you have about a dozen states with medical cannabis, and then of course federal prohibition. And we had a sort of gut feeling that something was going to happen. Got in a car, drove across the country, wrote a book, published the book, and now launched Cannabis Wire, which is sort of the second sort of half of that. The book sort of covers the movement. The site more or less covers the industry now.
I'm Ron Lopez. I'm from Vox.com. We cover general news, like for a general audience, but I've always been interested in the war on drugs, so it's just something that I kind of naturally started insisting to my editors that we should cover, and it's like a big story now, obviously with marijuana legalization going across the country and the opioid epidemic and things like that, so it's something that I'm now covering quite a bit.
Why don't we just finish since we start there, why you got into the business? Deb, I know you cover other things too, but tell me how you and Peter explain how you got into the drug business, so to speak.
So when I was doing work at thestreet.com, it's a financial website, and I did see a lot of these pot stocks showing up, and a lot of movement in them. They're penny stocks. There's just a lot of volatility in the pricing of these stocks, and it got me very interested in covering the companies. And the companies were maybe 50-50, reputable, 50% totally dodgy, a lot of shady players. And that was something that I felt was important to cover and make sure people understood that some of these companies were pretty shady and a lot of smoke and mirrors. And that's really kind of what got me involved in it. It's a very passionate following, but I also felt like I wanted to bring some very unbiased reporting to this group, because you find there's a lot of very passionate people reporting on this, and maybe there's a little bit too much bias in that. So I like to try to keep my reporting very neutral. And it's a fascinating area. Like Yusheen said, I really felt like as a journalist, this is going to be a huge story for the next several years in the financial markets as well as, culturally. And so that's why I just jumped on it and have stayed with it ever since. It's just, I'm always learning.
Well, my story goes back again to sort of the Ice Age. This was the 1980s, and Jesse Jackson came to the New York Times and visited with the editor at the time, Abe Rosenthal, who was virulently anti-drug, and for crack, heroin, and so on. Marijuana was very difficult to talk about because the impact was anywhere in the same world, and even linking it up was sort of a misleading thing. At that time, there were the same passions that exist today on both sides of the issue. There were a small number of people talking about legalization, mainly a guy named Mayor Schmoke in Baltimore, a few others. So covering it was hard. When I left the Times, I went to work running communications departments of health companies, but I took a little time out and worked for Phoenix House, the large drug treatment organization, was their vice president of communications. And to cut to today, just by chance, one of my clients is Columbia Kerr, which has, I think I said, dispensaries in 5 states and production facilities in 5 states and Washington, D.C. And I think is a noble, great company, but immerses me once again in the complexity of the marijuana regulation issue. And well, I'll leave it there. Sorry.
Well, it's actually fascinating. So it's interesting. I sort of stumbled on the cannabis beat. I'm from Southern California, so what's interesting is I more or less grew up with medical cannabis dispensaries around me and didn't really ever think about it in any sort of critical way. It just was what it was, and I think a lot of sort of California kids more or less, have that mindset. And it was winter break, I think, and Allison, who's from upstate New York, very different ecosystem, very different culture, and came out to visit. I took her to Venice Beach, and this was December 2009. We were taking a stroll, along the boardwalk, and of course, everyone was lighting up. And she looked at me and said, "Well, how is this legal?" And I was like, "That's an excellent question. I've never even thought about that." And it's just, I feel like that's the day we grabbed the string, and we just never stopped pulling. And I didn't even realize that it was legal for medical use anywhere but California. I just never even thought about it. So we started digging, we found that it was legal in about a dozen states. So this was sort of just like a side thing while we were graduating. We were wrapping up journalism school, and we sort of kept just talking about it and thinking about it. And then we realized that Prop 19 was going to be on the ballot. And so this was, about May, around graduation. The journalists in the room know that the market for journalism jobs was pretty bad in the summer of 2010. So we said we want to basically explore what's happening. We got into a car in September of 2010, and we started in Maine, and we drove across the country. We went to every single state that had a medical cannabis law at the time, with the exception of Alaska and Hawaii for, basic reasons. You can't drive there. And we were cash-strapped grad students. We didn't have a lot of money. And it was we just watched it sort of unfold in front of us. We were on the road when the feds went and did that multi-agency sort of national raid. They shut down Montana Cannabis like a week after we were there. It was just it was wild. we sort of took a little bit of a hiatus to write the book proposal, then went down to the federal farm in Mississippi, saw how they do cannabis there, and then we sort of wrapped up our reporting. I remember there was a day we were trying to get a book deal at that point, and we, we saw that the polls showed that Washington State was going to have like a 60% chance of legalizing. And we said, let's go to Washington State. And so we went out there, camped up with the campaign, watched it get legal, both in Colorado and Washington, and that's how the book opens, and we sort of say, how did we get here? And which I think is still a question that sort of shocks me today, and I just sort of can't believe the rate of change. It's just like if you told me that the Times would have written a 7-part editorial, pro-legalization, if you told me that, these states would bring in billions of dollars, if you told me that, we would be seeing, people like Peter Thiel investing, I mean, it's just every day I feel like I'm just surprised. It is a story of a lifetime. It's difficult. When you cover a niche story, I think it's changing now, but at the time when we told people we were driving across the country to report on cannabis, people sort of said, oh, Cheech and Chong, bring me some samples, how good is the weed and wherever, and it's just like, okay, well, there's more to it. And probably the most gratifying thing now is that our fellow journalists know that. And we just wanted to stay in it. We said we could write another book. This landscape is changing way, way, way too fast to publish another book. But by the time I even start writing the book, something's gonna give, something will be rescheduled or something. So we took everything we had. We launched Cannabis Wire. I feel very lucky. We have funding from the City of New York. I would have never thought that I would say that the City of New York is funding a cannabis news site, but they are. Columbia Journalism School, Stanford, and it feels very, we've come a long way, I guess I could say, and it's good to know that people want good information about this, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I started in undergraduate school. I took a drug war history class because I thought, oh, this will be easy credits. I get to read about drugs and listen to drugs for a few hours. Sounds easy. And I ended up just getting really interested in the whole thing, particularly in the devastation that the war on drugs has done to Latin America. And from that point, I just kind of started looking into drug policy more seriously. And since I graduated for journalism, so it was just a natural thing for me to cover at that point, just taking drug policy really seriously and finding some of the nuances in it and whatnot. So.
Great. I know there have been some anti-voices, in terms of cannabis and legalization, but it seems to me that there's been generally in the mainstream media pretty much a euphoria about it's inevitable. It's the medical marijuana is law of the land in 22 dozen states now, 4 or 5 states legalize recreational use. Is there a fear in the media to come up with some anti-negative pieces of the marijuana, get in front of the marijuana liberalization law train? Did you feel that anywhere? Deborah, do you feel that?
Oh, yeah. If I write something that is negative about a cannabis company, like I did a couple weeks ago, I covered this company, I looked at the documents on file, and it was awful. I mean, this company had no money. They wanted to raise money from the public. They were basically funding themselves to do whatever they wanted. And I talked to the company, and they did not give me good answers. But anyway, so I wrote this story, and I basically said, this is not a company you want to invest in. And I just got beat up. I mean, when I tell you, they just start hammering you hard. You get hit on Twitter, you get emails saying that you're an idiot, you're stupid, you don't know what you're talking about. And you have to have a tough skin to be able to, do your work and be willing to say something that may not be positive, and you do get attacked for that.
Well, Peter, how about at the Times, in the old days, you were writing something pro-marijuana was probably exactly the opposite side, I would imagine. And,
No, it was.
but what about now? Do you look like you're archaic and out of step if you guys write a piece that maybe there's some issues here, we're not, maybe psychological issues?
I think that there's sort of a larger context for this. There's a wonderful history called The American Disease by a Yale historian and psychiatrist named David Musto, who chronicles not only the United States since the mid-1800s, but in China as well, that drug use and acceptance or rejection tends to happen in cycles. And in the beginning, there's often a kind of euphoria, and by the end, great examples was happening with cocaine. In the 70s, it was the champagne drug. In the 80s, it was crack. And the reactions are extreme in both directions, but notoriously, each of these epidemics The media is not critical, as critical as you would expect. And in retrospect, you say, how come they didn't ask this question? And I think that that applies today too. As it happens, the people on this panel are creating some of the best journalism about marijuana. So I'm not aiming at this, but I'll take a swipe at my old employer in that 7-part series on legalization. And by the way, I don't really have a policy prescription. I just am talking about what's good journalism, not what's good policy. If you look at the health component of it, they constantly interpret inconclusive studies as evidence that marijuana is not harmful. Well, maybe yes, maybe no, but they are not cautionary in that way. And that goes from the cancer issues to the adolescents to brain. Mark Kleiman has, and 2 others have a really good book that you can get outside here on marijuana legalization. The answer is that the real horrible story is the lack of research for a drug that's been used by tens of millions of people for years, and people don't really focus on the bad guys there. But to step back, I would say in a cautionary way that I'm not in the journalism business anymore, but the field is not as critical as it might be. And to write a story that has the assumption that we're in a headlong move towards a better tomorrow is simple-minded, and it's not compensated by going and quoting Kevin Sabet, or Sabet is it, and giving him a paragraph. I'm not against legalization, but I am against superficial journalism. I think there's a lot of it out there.
Yeah, let me be more specific. Medical marijuana, again, a couple of other states. There've been no drug tests on this. No tests on this. It's a Schedule I drug, obviously, and so there've been no clinical trials for every single other drug that you can possibly get recommended or prescription for. You can't get a prescription for marijuana because it's not it's not FDA approved. I haven't seen a lot of criticism. I know there's been some written about this in the media about the fact that here at Vox or Vermont.
Yeah, to the extent we've written about it, usually it's from the angle that like the reason there's not that much research is because of the way the drug is scheduled. So in some ways it's like hard to be critical of the government for this, or I mean it's hard to be critical of like dispensaries for doing this, because in some ways it's actually the government's fault that there's a lack of research. The Schedule I status just makes it really hard. Until the 90s there actually wasn't even like an established process for like researchers that could reliably get marijuana and study it for medical purposes. So to some extent, that's one of the things that just makes this be difficult, is that there's a lack of research, but part of the reason there's a lack of research is because the government has been so restrictive with it by putting it as a Schedule I drug, assuming it has no medical value whatsoever. And so that's one reason that it's really difficult to be too critical of these dispensaries, because in the end, I mean, we do have a bunch of anecdotal evidence, at least, that it helps like some kids with epilepsy. We also have anecdotal evidence in some of the other directions for these drugs. But it just seems like it's hard to be too critical of these dispensaries when the lack of research is really the government's fault.
Well, is that the right side to err on?
There is research. I mean, GW Pharmaceuticals, Incest Therapeutics, they have phase 3 clinical trials going on now. There's a lot of research done in Israel. So there are studies out there.
Yeah.
I just want to jump in on that. Well, 2 things. One, so cannabis was actually being studied a little bit sooner than that, which is how, Barbara Randall, Ms. Glaucoma, all that got sorted, and then the government was actually distributing cannabis up until the 90s. But I just think it comes down to almost, and it's interesting, it's like there's a word problem, right? So when you talk to Nora Volkow, or you talk to somebody with the DEA and they say medical marijuana or medical cannabis, they're talking about the compounds in the plant, right? They have if you go back and you read, the IOM report, you read, it says if there's a future for, cannabis as medicine, it lies in its compounds. And then on the street, you're hearing medical cannabis or medical marijuana, and that is the whole plant. And digging into sort of why that is something that I just feel journalists confuse it, right? If Hillary Clinton stands up and says, I want more research in medical marijuana, what does she mean? We don't know what she means. We don't know if she's talking about the Norvaco, United, is she talking about whole plant, is she full whole plant, will the system ever allow whole plant? So that sort of like nuance is not being resolved. And right now we have a situation where you have, the state sort of legalizing a whole plant. Some states are only legalizing extracts. A lot of companies are essentially taking extraction process into their own hands. But then you've got this really snail's pace sort of actual FDA clinical trial process that's fundamentally different. So it's like two worlds. We have two worlds going on.
I would add one thing about this. I think it is a very good story. If you look at the logic, this drug would be in Schedule 1 because there isn't any evidence to suggest its medical utility. But if you go further and say, why is that research not there? The answer is because it's Schedule 1. And you can't break that logjam. And there is research in Israel, and the GW is doing something. These are specs for something that's being used by tens of millions of people. There are probably a dozen, or at least a half dozen questions that aren't answered until we have long-term longitudinal studies, and you don't get your only marijuana for experimentation, I'd say, from the University of Mississippi, which can supply it to a handful of researchers. So I think the government has a lot to answer for on this, and that there is a certain amount of, as there are everywhere, a certain amount of ideology at work. People are very rigid and protective of their belief systems.
I think one thing I wanted to add with that is that it's useful to like separate what we mean by research too, because there are certainly smaller studies and like medium scale studies. I mean, there are people out there who will, right outside the store, who will tell you that they've done research on marijuana. So the hindrance with the schedule is that there are no large scale clinical trials that we would expect for other drugs. There are some in the process for, and there's like Marinol out there, but like as far as like studying the full extent of the plant, that hasn't really been taken on as much as you would expect given all the movement in all these states.
Not to get sort of philosophical, but in a way, also, I think it's hard for some people to wrap their heads around it when you realize that this plant has so, you know, it's like depending on who you talk to, not only is it the legal status changed based on where you are, but, you know, when was the last time we had something where you have X millions of people saying, oh, this is my medicine. You have X millions of people saying, no, this is my nightcap. I use this to get high. You have X number of people saying, oh, no, this is for religious purposes. So it's just like there's an identity crisis situation. You have the legal patchwork and identity patchwork. And so I just think like if you really sit in that, and sort of that tension that exists right now, we really don't know what the future of this plant is. It's really interesting.
Right. I mean, is the media getting that right? I mean, and specifically about your outlets. I mean, is the media getting that idea right? Are they covering that well enough? I mean, are they being critical enough of the federal government? I don't. I
think
mean,
they're going that high up. I think people are sort of covering things as they're unfolding before them. Oh, the dispensary open. Oh, the state legalized. Whatever. Oh, Bernie Sanders said X, Y, Z. But when it comes down to really just sitting and digging deep into what does medical mean? What is the future of this plant? What are we doing? What are we in the middle of right now? I don't think that's happening enough.
Well, that could be. I know when you're in the media and a story is exploding in front of you, and this is kind of a slow motion explosion. It's not like the plane crash or the catastrophe downtown Manhattan. It takes some thinking to get back and say, wait, let's look at where this is going. And I can understand how the media doesn't always get a chance to do that. You put one foot in front of another. You're on so lots of moving stuff here. But it seems that we haven't, in some ways, maybe we haven't gotten high enough and looked at it from 40,000 feet. No, 10.
Well, I think you start covering it and you feel like you've already written that story.
Yeah.
And so, and a lot of times as journalists, you forget that maybe it's good to go back and reiterate the story or visit it again. But you think I wrote that 2 years ago. I wrote that 3 years ago. I don't want to write that
That's
again.
an inside baseball story. It happens to media across the landscape. I spent a little bit of time sitting on the news desk, and it's like, everybody knows about that. You get your bureau chief comes in from City Hall and you say, this is a great story about the mayor. I said, no, everybody knows about that. Somebody wrote about that like 18 months ago. I said, nobody knows about that. Right about that.
One part of why I think the coverage sometimes becomes overly simplistic, in addition to some of the things we've already talked about, is that a news story, actually, Vox is an exception to this, but a news story in the New York Times sense at 800 words does not allow more than one major thought. So if you have an issue, or as I see it, you're weighing a complex set of variables, and that is the damage the law causes versus the damage the drug causes, and how do you decide how society makes that equation work with limited research. That's a complicated story. 800 words just doesn't take it. Now, when I was at the Times, one of the nice things was I could take 3 weeks off and do a story. But most of the media doesn't permit, the business model just doesn't permit that.
What comes to coverage is winners and losers in new businesses, and I don't know how you guys are covering this. A lot of alcohol and cannabis, there's been a lot of, we heard the line, a lot of people use for a long time said, it's safer than alcohol, therefore we ought to legalize it. I don't think that's a valid argument. I've worked with big alcohol for a long time. Secondly, there's a question of alcohol could be a loser in this. You know, is this a recreational option for, you know, for like occasion option for? You guys covered any of that, or is that an interesting topic?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe from the business side, I don't know.
I mean, they did find that in Colorado that sales of beer declined. So it was definitely an issue. And of course, it's Colorado, so that's home of, you know, Coors and a lot of microbrews. So it was definitely a concern, and it has borne out to be true.
What about you guys on the
Well, from my perspective, when I cover alcohol, it's usually from like it's a public health concern. Kills 88,000 people a year, or there are 88,000 deaths linked to alcohol each year. So I don't necessarily see those sales declines as a bad sign or a bad thing. So from the public health perspective, it could be a good thing if marijuana replaces some alcohol use. But that's sort of where I approach the issue, and it is. But even the research on that, on whether there's actually a substitution effect, it's still really early. So it's kind of hard to say which way that's going.
So you're kind of an anti-alcohol journalist. You bring your own opinions to your reporting. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess I would say I'm an anti-alcohol journalist. You guys can drink as much as you want. I'm not
You
gonna.
a reporter or a columnist?
What?
You a reporter or a columnist?
I'm like a reporter columnist. Depends on the article.
Yeah, just checking. I don't know.
See, I think that the reporter story to come out of that is big alcohol bracing for losses? Are they positioning themselves in any way for this damage? And then the next thing is, are there secret plans being drawn up in some room for entering the marijuana industry with a schedule changes, or what is it that would bring them in? And that goes for big pharma and big tobacco too. So when you hear there's some substitution going on, I think there's stories that are generated from that that go beyond, I don't mean to be critical of what you do, because Fox, it gives a lot of information, but that go beyond giving a point to this side or to that side. I would mention one thing. There's going to be I think there's a presentation with Rosalie Pakula later about the health effects of marijuana. One of the things that's really fascinating, and I'm doing some pro bono work on this, is that we now have pretty solid evidence that where you have legally available medical marijuana, opioid overdose deaths drop, and so do admissions for treatment. This is true since the 90s. These are population studies that have been done both at the University of Pennsylvania and by Rand. And with more than 30,000 people dying a year from opioid overdoses, I think there's a lack of urgency on this research. Because maybe if we could knock off 10% of those deaths, 20% of those deaths, huge public health victory. And you don't see that now. Vox has done that story. I haven't seen it anywhere else. And I think it's a hell of a great story.
One thing that's go ahead, sorry. One thing that's interesting is the big alcohol, big tobacco coming into the industry is I heard this yesterday. I can't remember which panel, but like apparently big alcohol is actually not that interested in marijuana because they're worried that they'll be competing against themselves basically. But big tobacco, which is obviously losing a market in the U.S., is interested in going into the marijuana industry, and in fact they're like waiting for federal legalization. They're like preparing for that because that would obviously replace a lot of the market that are losing now.
Reporters that cover issues tend to have a very personal interest in those issues. Tend to. I mean, I think we gravitate towards the things we like. It's not different. It's often not different in the newsroom or around the desk someplace. Alcohol, people who cover alcohol, and I've worked for many years with big alcohol, the largest company in the world, they don't mind being at the bar and having a couple of cocktails. It tends to be with the culture. Plus, they hang around with the alcohol business people who are, they do and buy. It doesn't mean they're drunks. In fact, you're out like that if that happens in the big alcohol business. Boom. People who cover the auto industry tend to have cars, like cars, hang around. Do you have to smoke pot to cover the recreational pot business in the United States?
No, I don't. But so I used to when I was in college, and I mean it would have been like 4 years ago because I'm fairly young. But but I don't anymore. So it's I don't think you.
That's right. There's no drug people, no law enforcement.
Oh no,
we stopped them at the door.
I'm from DC, so it's legal there. So I wouldn't have to lie about it anyway.
I feel like it's it's changed, right? I think that was maybe a more fair assumption a few decades ago, but I think now it's really like a beat, right? And there's sub-beats, right? It's like you have the financial angle, you tend to focus on more policy sort of pieces in a way. You know, there's a criminal justice angle. For me, it's like I feel like I've sort of gone through the transition. It started as sort of a social justice sort of like legal tension thing, and now I like to think of Cannabis as sort of becoming more watchdog journals for the business. I think we do need watchdog journals, and I think that right now, and actually Vox asks a lot of these important questions, it's sort of a question of how, right? It was like, do we legalize? I think the big question now is how do we legalize? What does that look like? We need to talk about taxes and advertising, but I think then in 5-10 years, then it's like, how do we make sure that the businesses that are cropping up now that are going to be the big name brands of tomorrow are the most legitimate ones? And right now, it's sort of, no one's looking at that, you know, so sort of anyone can sort of slip in through the door right now. And we need to be a little more vigilant, I think. So it changes, it's evolving.
I don't know, I would say for me, I mean, I was in high school in the 70s, so there you go. You know, and I tell my son these stories about how the kids were smoking pot out in the back and the principals had their binoculars and that would not happen today at all. So I've kind of seen it go from the 70s, and then we had the Reagan years and Just Say No and Nancy Reagan, and then we've kind of come onto the other side of that. You know, I don't know, I've got a teenage son, and as I tell him, you know, I've covered the robotics industry. That doesn't mean that I went out and built robots. I wrote about it, and that's what I did. And I've written about several different subjects, and just because I've written about IPOs doesn't mean I'm going to go out and make myself public. So to me, it's not, I know what you're saying, but to me, in my coverage, I don't think it really matters whether I did or didn't. It's
No,
just
I
another,
it's a personal preference among reporters. I mean, I don't know. It tends to be a democratic, a demographic line in my experience of talking to the people who cover cannabis. And you know, they tend to be there tends to be a bit of a young and old, and there's plenty of anecdotes that completely belie this. But I mean, generally, I think if you took a survey, tend to be younger people covering the cannabis business, tend to be white covering the cannabis business, tend to be more affluent covering the cannabis business. That could be a media problem across the board, by the way. So does that change the coverage because it tends to be more monolithic where the reporters come from generally?
I think there's a huge loss of coverage of minority and real poor communities. And by parallel, I mean, why did we miss what was the underlying Trump story? Why did we miss the desperation of people dying of opioids, unemployed, no opportunity, angry, until we had primaries to show the anger? Well, because those of us, I think us, but those of you in the media, well, you don't go exactly to those towns, and you don't have friends in those communities. It's not a conscious decision. It just, you go through life and you don't touch that. And I think that poor minorities in this country have had their story not told on the drug beat generally as much as it could. And in terms of marijuana, I think it may be a different experience and different attitudes. I haven't explored it thoroughly myself, but I think we suffer more than whether we do the drugs or not. I think our economic and racial background limits us.
And I think to some degree it's interesting. I think the racial justice argument was a much more key component of the initial legalization campaigns. And so I think that sort of, it worked, like the media was already talking about it, and then the campaigns talking about it sort of created a situation where everyone was looking at cannabis legalization in the context of the drug war. And I feel like that's getting lost. So I think that what you're describing might actually get worse, where there's like, no one's really, you know, I see some stories about, you know, shops being sort of concentrated in lower income communities. So I think that's, you know, good that stories like that are coming out. But now when the sort of tax revenue argument becomes the reason to legalize, then
Big money comes in, it changes the coverage.
yeah, goes away.
I would go even further than just like the U.S. focus with this racial justice, because a lot of the countries that are really suffering the most from the war on drugs are Latin American, Western African countries, where there are these massive drug cartels just sweeping through and killing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people a year. And if you don't have a background, like if you're not an immigrant from one of those countries, you might be less interested in it. So that's another way that the media's demographic, like monolithic kind of demographics, do play a role in masking a big part of the story, the war on drugs and marijuana in general.
This may be a problem that's pervasive throughout the media, not just through the covering marijuana and cannabis and this whole industry. But there's a lot of sponsored content out there, particularly on websites, and not necessarily real websites. I'm not singling you out. Hard to tell. It's a little bit opaque which side people are on. And everybody's got websites now, Forbes does, and the Times and everything else, less sponsored content in some places. Do you think that's a problem that a lot of people, the business is so new and it's such a gold rush here because this trend line's going like this? I don't think there's any question about that, no matter what happens. Do you think that it's the information is sometimes a bit tainted or a bit partisan, and the readers and the viewers don't know that difference? Are you comfortable with that in the media that covers cannabis?
I think, but from my perspective, the media is getting better at the sponsored content thing. It used to be like when I think BuzzFeed was like one of the first websites to do it. It used to be really hard to discern, is this sponsored content or not? But nowadays, at least the sites I've seen, including Vox, we like put like a black banner says sponsored. We actually I've seen a bunch of websites do this where like the entire background might be black on the website, on top of like noting that this is sponsored content somehow. And so I think they're taking care, but I do think it's like it might be a thing in like local outlets. I remember I used to work at an outlet in Cincinnati, and the publisher there was really excited that marijuana may be legalized, because that would mean a bunch of business money, a bunch of local dispensaries would be like throwing advertisement money at us that we wouldn't have before, and that's something that probably is happening to some extent at the local level. And I'm not sure if that's like skewing media coverage. I would like to think it's not, but it's something that might.
Well, it bothers me because there's a website out there called Marijuana Times. And they contacted me and said, would you write a story for us? You know, we'll pay you like a freelancer. I'm like, oh, okay, that's normal. Okay, well, here's what we want you to do. We want you to cover this company, and we want you to write something positive. Okay, that's when the red flags go up as a journalist, and you go, wait a minute. No, that's not how it works. I'll look at the company, and I'll take, my notes, and then I'll determine how I'm going to cover it. So as I start looking at this company, I realized that the company they wanted me to write positive about was the company that owns Marijuana Times. And lo and behold, they've gotten like 9 different positive articles about the company that they own. So they own the website, they're paying for these positive stories about the company that they're about to take public that's gonna bring the money back to them. And it's just smoke and mirrors. And they don't note it as sponsored content because now it gets gray. It's not paid for specifically by this company. So they kind of skirt the FTC rules on sponsored content. But they are in fact paying for these positive stories about a company that's very shady. And I think you're gonna see a lot more of that. We were talking about that a little earlier about how, as journalists, you're not making a whole lot of money. And when somebody starts, flipping some $100 bills in front of you and saying, would you write this story and make it a good one? It's, for some people, it's hard to turn down.
I would argue that that's not only on the micro level, because journalists are hungrier than they used to.
About writing that, if not for Forbes, for plenty of journalism.
It's tough.
It's a great story.
And I think that, for somebody like Cannabis Wire who's trying to do something, really neutral and unbiased and trying to present this information, it makes you mad when you find out that this guy down the street is not playing by the rules, if you will.
We sort of have a few problems, right? So it's interesting. One is like, I think that the lines are blurred where people don't quite understand what you mean when you say nonpartisan. And so Alice and I have had a few freelancers come to us. We look in their background, it looks like they're okay, they're clear, they graduated from a good journalism school, they write a piece for us, and then they go write something for like, weed something or another, weed feed or something like that. It's like, oh, and it makes us look, because they don't understand the difference. But that's one tier. There's another sort of tier that I think journalists need to think about, which is sort of industry-backed publications, not necessarily that are doing that, but just industry-backed publications in general, and sort of the holes that they fill, because they have money and journalists don't, right? So you kind of have a bit of a funding issue there. But I think probably one thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about more that any of this, I think, is, because at least if you go to Marijuana Times, you know it's Marijuana Times. But one publication, or there's a couple of publications that have really caught my eye as a journalist, and that's looking at places like the Cannabis with the Denver Post. And that's really interesting because here you have a mainstream local newspaper that's done an offshoot, and they're hosting cannabis award ceremonies there, telling you which vaporizer to use there, you know, and so you kind of have to ask yourself as a journalist, and people are very divided on this issue, right? Which is, are we there yet, right? Are you, just because it's legal in Colorado, are we there yet? Meaning that they can just embrace it like wine. It's no longer a debate, we're not talking policy anymore, we're talking about policy, you know, 50% of the time. And now we can just talk about it like it's normal. Or is your responsibility, the newsroom, in the epicenter of this, still to inform the rest of the country? And instead of devoting reporters to getting high or growing weed or whatever, is your responsibility to put reporters in investigative units, to have them gathering data and making sure that the rest of the country is going into this really informed. And that's a big debate. Some people say the Denver Post is fine, they're doing it right, and other people say not so much.
That kind of takes me to my next question, if we've gotten there. Where, in your view, is the media getting it wrong? And I assume you guys would address this if you could. I mean, but is there a major place where it's getting it wrong? Just in general, the media in general. I mean, you could talk specifically to your outlets, but is there a place where it's wrong, and where is it really getting it right?
Yeah, I think, you go.
Well, I was just gonna say, the part that I think where they're getting it wrong is when you have, and I have a lot of colleagues at CNBC, but when you have the CNBC reporter going hee hee and giggling,
The pun headline.
or you have the, you know, sadly, the New York Times, you know, I went on a road trip to Denver, and this is how I smoked pot. And you're like, oh my God, really? Really? You know, like the Maureen Dowd column where she ate the brownie and couldn't leave her hotel room.
For 2 weeks or something.
And you're just like, and that's when you shake your head and go, no, can we not giggle, and can we not do, you know, like you said, the Cheech and Chong road trip, and just do this seriously?
So actually, sorry, just real quick to the Maureen Dowd. So it's interesting because that sort of took the internet by storm, right? Everyone made fun of her. In a way, I will say that she stands. The reason why I think she stands out as possibly an exception to the rule is that the giggling and I went and got high to no end is useless, right? Then it just becomes a sort of puff piece. The interesting thing about her experience was that it did influence policy. And so I think that there's somewhat of a benefit to the fact that she I mean, it's not that people didn't know that edible overdoses were happening, it's that she's so big that she took a sort of small issue, and people, regulators were voting her experience. MPP put a billboard up with her likeness, you know, looking devastated in a hotel room, right? So it's sort of like, that I think is okay. So that could have gone wrong if she, I think she had another column about Colorado that didn't influence policy. It was just like, look, it's legal and I'm there. And then 6 months later she had this column. And I think that column was actually good.
But I felt like she didn't do her homework. She went to go do the story and didn't look up anything on it and just showed up. And to me, you do your homework before you do a story. You don't just go, I didn't know that the amounts of this or that when I ate it. It's like, well, if you would have done any kind of research before you wrote your story, you would have known this.
You know,
What's interesting is the media, so not to counter, but so I interviewed her actually about this, and so what's interesting is that her experience was greatly mischaracterized. So the whole, she shoved a chocolate bar in her mouth, and you know, and people started doing like spoofs of it, like, oh, I went to a hotel and drank a handle of vodka and I was spinning. Like, I get that, and if that was true, then absolutely, but they got it wrong. So she actually did just take a little bite off the end, and to some extent, that's not, you know, tourists aren't going to do their homework. That's the thing. Like, we can't expect tourists to go do their homework. They're probably not. They're going to go and be like, sweet, let's go get really, really, really high, and then go back to Mississippi or wherever where this is totally prohibited. And they're going to go overboard because that's what you do when you go on vacation. So I feel like, in a way, it was true to life, even though we do expect more from journalists. I think you're right. We do expect more.
It's like a visit to Amsterdam. We tend to go overboard on a lot of things.
Yeah. You know, I was just going to say, I don't know the answer to this question, but I have a serious question about the coverage this weekend in the Times. Not only was there the trip through marijuana land in Colorado, there was another piece, a quite moving piece, by a 74-year-old man who's been smoking marijuana for at least 40 years, 50 years, whose wife's got Parkinson's. He gets relief in the care. It's a very moving piece. It's highly subjective. This is a guy who loves his marijuana. And I think that's fair to a degree, but when those are the two pieces that are in the Times, is the Times contextualizing this properly? I mean, if you're 74, you've done all this stuff and it has all benefits, that's fine. But there are a lot of people who've had bad experiences, Maureen one of them, but I think younger people. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this weekend's coverage, and I don't know if you balance it with something else. 2 stories themselves can be justified, but overall, I'm not sure. The message seems to be an editorializing one, if that's all that's in the Times this weekend. And I throw that out to the panel or anybody else.
Where's the media coverage going to be 5 years from now? There's going to be.
Well, I just wanted to answer the where the media coverage is getting it wrong, because one thing is that, we mentioned this in this panel, but it's really simplified. The coverage tends to focus on, should we legalize or should we not? And like the theme of this conference, there's like way more options in between, like do we have to do commercialization, do we have to do all these, like, there's like a bunch of policy issues that just don't get touched on. And to a certain degree, it's probably because it's just easier to do it. Is it, should we legalize or should we not? These are like arguments we've been having for like decades, and relegating those isn't exactly difficult to do as a journalist. Like it's really easy to call MPP on one side and then call Sam on the other side, get quotes from Kevin and Mason at MPP, and you get what you want. But there's a bunch of room in between, and for the most part, the media just doesn't coverage it.
Well, he said, she said, is certainly so, you know, you need a contrary opinion, or we need a conflict. That's one of the diseases that has probably damaged our information flow from the media. You know, and it's a problem. Again, it's not relegated to the cannabis and the marijuana coverage, but where will it be in 5 years? You think it's going to be completely normalized? It looks like the train is on the way there. It'll be like covering alcohol, like you said, wine or any other legitimate business, and it's going to be a gazillion-dollar business. I mean, you hear the estimates from where it is now to where it's going to be in 5 years or 10 years. It's hard to tell, but it's going to be north of where it is today, I guarantee that. So where do you think it'll be?
Yeah, in a world where California has legalized, and that's going to be a massive industry, like actually legalized. I mean, they have the medical industry that's pretty close to legalization if you go on Venice Beach right now. But for the most part, in the world where California legalizes, and that just gives rise to a big industry, and it'll be a few more states this year probably, it's like really hard to imagine the media not shifting its coverage to take it more seriously from like how might cover like the alcohol industry or tobacco industry today.
I think that one of the big questions is, and some parts of the conference can answer that, is what is the casualty rate of vastly increased usage? And I don't know the answer to it. Certain people would say that it's going to be significant, particularly for young people. To me, the great story would be, we have this sort of celebratory coverage, going against that and finding a story that says, hey, no, all you guys are being overly simplistic. There's a dark side here. It's a hell of a good story in a place like Colorado. I don't think the data's emerged yet for that, but it's possible that in 5 years we'd see another type of coverage that's more conflicted.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of euphoria, it seems to me. I mean, there are some issues in Colorado showing up. Am I wrong about that? I've read some stuff about some crime and some issues that seem to be related to
I
that.
just think it's too. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it's twofold. I think one. I think, not to be sort of doomsday. I think we're going to look back, and I think journalists are going to feel like they dropped the ball, because I feel like even though Vox is asking a lot of key questions now, I feel like we should have been asking that when Colorado and Washington were going for a vote, and we didn't. And so in a way, we sort of already paved. Some part of this is already solidified, so we can't change that. And even if every state goes a different way, we still have Colorado and Washington as they are, and Oregon and Alaska. So I do think we've dropped the ball in a pretty bad way. And I think if you go forward, I just think people are going to diversify. You're going to have a science, someone who's just covering what you're describing, right? Just the health effects, and the fatalities and so on and so forth. You'll have maybe someone who's just an edibles writer. You might have somebody who's actually just finally giving the criminal justice angle the attention it deserves. Somebody might be global. Someone's going to, some news organizations, you might see them branching out, having someone in Uruguay, someone in Toronto, someone, wherever. So I think it's going to, now it's like we call it a cannabis beat, but is it really a cannabis beat anymore? Is it like, an umbrella of a lot of small
Like the
beats
business
now?
cut media, I mean, you don't just cover business.
Yeah, business,
you cover,
tech, there's gonna be cannabis
M&A,
tech,
you
yeah.
cover sectors, you cover, so I guess that would be like that. There are a lot of, there seems to be some exaggerations in terms of what medical cannabis does and does not do. I mean, there's clearly a lot of evidence that it's a pain management issue for sure. It really works on a lot of issues there. There've been a lot of outstanding claims appeared in some legitimate media about what it can and cannot do, or at least in the voices of the pro and the anti, because this is two radical sides like the rest of the country. Where do you find good sources that you really trust, rather than somebody who's pro, as Ron talked about, and somebody who's anti? Is it hard to find legitimate sources or not that have more of I would say, a balanced view? Or do you always look for the bad guys and the good guys, the pro and the con?
Well, I think science journals is always hard, right? So it's not just with cannabis. I mean, you're referencing specifically studies and stuff like that. So I think, like, there was this one New England Journal of Medicine study that came out maybe 3 years ago, and it was mind-boggling. It was they did a survey. One survey was like how many doctors would recommend medical. They did a sort of case study of a woman with breast cancer, right? How many doctors would recommend cannabis to this person? And then they did a reader survey. And every single media outlet quoted the reader survey as a doctor survey. They said 80% of doctors would recommend medicine. It's like, that's absolutely not true. And it was everywhere. Like, not one outlet, LA Times, ABC, you name it. And I think that that's not just cannabis. I mean, it is worse because we know so little about it, but health journalism, science journalism is suffering. And every reporter on the beat that I've spoken to people at the Denver Post, the AP, and then Seattle Times, and they all say the biggest concern, the one part that's so hard to wrap their heads around, is the science journalism aspect.
One thing that I'm going to take my life in my hands and criticize Sanjay Gupta. Anecdotal journalism. We have a wonderful story here of a little girl who's suffering and is miraculously being cured, is much more powerful than scientific journalism. But in terms of the recognition that, particularly with the national media, we're creating new policy just by reporting in that way, it's very irresponsible, I think, to do that. And I'll just cite the Charlotte's Web phenomenon. When Sanjay Gupta talked about the miraculous effect of what was a strain of marijuana coming from one company in Colorado, and called Charlotte's Web. There's a girl named Charlotte who was on the show, terrible epilepsy victim, who was ostensibly cured by this, when there was no data really at that time to indicate it. The tragedy was that, as I understand, the Denver Post did a very good story on this, didn't it? Yeah. Hundreds of people, I think it was, picked up and went to Colorado to be near the company that created Charlotte's Web. Leaving aside the fact that there may be, those benefits very well may be true, the company was not equipped to handle all of those patients. The dosage, the consistency was very unscientific. This resulted in people sometimes selling their homes to get to Colorado. Very sad story. I think it was a little bit irresponsible. And, what is it, 13, 15 states now have passed Charlotte's Web law, particularly allowing the use of high CBD content products. These legislators were working without any scientific data. It was Sanjay's stories that were very moving. Well, I don't think that's good journalism. I think it's dangerous, and I think it's irresponsible. Whether or not epilepsy can be assisted by this product, I just don't think you'd go there.
So can I jump onto that, because I think that that's an interesting, so I actually think that his documentary went two ways. And what you're describing is the bad part, right, which is you have states passing laws based on unworkable laws, right? No one, you can in theory possess CBD and no one knows how you're going to get it. And that was bad, and the families, fleeing Colorado, that was bad. The flip side, and this is sort of, and I think he could have gone about it in a better way, though, is that in many ways the reason why Epidiolex is going, wrapping phase 3 trials and is sort of was fast-tracked, it was overwhelmingly because of the great demand that documentary sparked. And the company cites it, and the FDA cites it in why they push it through. They said it was due to rising sort of demand from the patient-physician community, and that was inspired by. So in a way, the pharmaceutical angle was probably what we needed. The people running to Colorado, not so much.
Well, I think as a journalist, I mean, and you've alluded to this, that it's a different dynamic now in journalism as to how the media gets paid and how they make money and page views, et cetera. So you do a lot of, gumshoe leather work where you're, for me, digging through filings with the SEC that takes hours to do. Some of these studies, reading these phase 3 trials, it takes hours going through it, and you may spend, 5 to 10 hours working on a story, just digging through documents, and then you get 3,000 views. And you're like, okay, well, great, I made, I don't know, $50 on that story, but I spent 10 hours researching it. And I think that's what I do, is I still, you know, I have to do enough pieces that will make me money, but then I still do these pieces where I literally am just pouring through documents to get my data.
Yeah, well, I think that the media, it can be a thankless job in some cases.